Hey everyone, how's it going? This slideshow presentation is going to be specifically about mechanisms of evolution and how they change what's going on in a population. As we look at mechanisms of evolution, mechanisms tell us how things take place or how something is going to occur. And when we talk about evolution, there's 5 basic ways that things occur. When we talk about evolution, we got to remember that evolution only happens to a population. It never happens to an individual. So the 5 processes that allow evolution to occur are going to be natural selection, gene flow, genetic drift, mutations, and non-random mating. These are the 5 things that can happen to a population. They're going to change the gene frequencies of the population because that's what evolution really is. It's a change in gene frequencies, which in turn changes the phenotypes of a population over time. Now, by far, the one mechanism of these that has the biggest impact on evolution is going to be natural selection. That is by far going to be the biggest one. So let's talk a little bit about each of these 5 things throughout this show, and hopefully we'll have a little better idea of what's going on with the process of evolution. First, let's talk about selection. Selection occurs in one of 2 ways. Natural selection is what goes on out in nature, and this is the idea that there's hunters, there's hunted, there's certain features that are successful, certain features that aren't successful. If we look back to the rock pocket mouse video that we watched in class, it was very successful on the lava flow to have a darker fur color because you kind of blended into the background and were eaten by the owls or the coyotes or whatever else was hanging out in the desert. On the lighter sand, there was the lighter colored mouse, the more brownish sandy colored mouse, and that was just natural selection driving those things. The mice that had the darker variation on the lava flows tended to be more successful, and they were allowed to survive and reproduce, which hopefully you remember that's what evolution is all about, is survival and reproduction. If you survive, you get to reproduce. If you reproduce, your genes go on to the next generation, and those are the things that we tend to see in the phenotypes. The other type of selection that we have is what we call artificial selection. Artificial selection is when somebody or something forces 2 things to breed because they have a desirable trait. I always go towards racehorses. People like to bet on racehorses. People like to watch them run fast. Well, if you want a fast racehorse, you're going to look on your farm and say, oh, that male horse is pretty fast, that female horse is pretty fast. We're going to have them make a baby, and hopefully they get a fast horse. I wouldn't mate my fastest female with Sir Gimps-a-Lot because he's kind of just limping around the pasture and not really doing too much. I'm going to take the fast horse with a fast horse and hopefully get another fast horse. We do the same thing with food. I like big red strawberries, so I'm going to find my 2 biggest, reddest strawberry plants. I'm going to take pollen from one, put it on the flowers of the other one to go with the ovules, and hopefully get better strawberry seeds as I move forward. So artificial selection can be with plants, it could be with animals, but usually that's a man-made or human-made desired trait that we're trying to move forward. Now, when we talk about natural selection, this is all about certain things being better for survival. And when we look at the tiger, we see the black stripes help that tiger with the orangish color blend kind of in. Now, if you look at that tiger, you can see on the chest and on the bottom of the face, it's actually kind of white. Well, that's because nature hasn't selected against white color on the bottom of the tiger. That really doesn't matter. On the top of the tiger, though, the orange and black coat is much more successful than a white tiger. We tend not to see a lot of white tigers in the wild because it's a lot harder for them to go and hunt for food because they stand out like a sore thumb. And if you're a gazelle or whatever, elephant or whatever, and you see a big white tiger there, you're like, hey, that's a bad guy. I don't want to be around that guy. And that guy's not going to survive. They're not going to reproduce, and they're not going to pass the white tiger genes on. We tend to see white tigers in the zoos, though, because they're pretty. And that could be as a result of artificial selection. So the big thing with natural selection is when you have a trait that is desirable, you survive up to a reproduction age, and you can pass those genes on to the next generation. If we look at this picture of a camel, this shows a bunch of different adaptations that have been passed on from generation to generation because these are really successful traits for the camel. Camels tend to live in deserty areas. This one, the dromedary camel, you always know that with the single hump, tends to live in the hotter deserts. And when we look at all of these different adaptations that it has to help live in the dry and hot regions. It's got long legs, keeps it off the hot sand. It's got a leathery mouth so it can eat spiky plants. It's got long eyelashes, helps keep sand out of the eyes. All of those things that we sort of saw in that movie, the Planet Earth video that we watched about deserts. We saw the cold weather camel, the Bactrian with 2 humps, and we saw a little bit of the single hump camel. If we look at this picture of this hummingbird, well, when I'm looking at that hummingbird eating out of the flower, there's a lot of adaptations that I'm looking at over there. One of them, well, they can beat their wings really fast. 55 times a second is stupidly fast. That allows hummingbirds to do that hovering thing that they do. They have an extended beak to get on into that long flower so that they can get the nectar out of that flower. And they have a really small body shape and body size so that they're able to sit there and fly. Their bones are going to be kind of hollowed out. All bird bones are pretty hollow so that they can actually fly. So we see adaptations everywhere. And I'm going to assume that color helps with its defense mechanisms also. Or maybe it helps find a mate. When we're talking about this is all about the gene pool. And the gene pool sort of tells us what's going on with the population of animals. So the gene pool is all the alleles of the population. And when we look at a gene pool and we look at what's in the gene pool, we can find allelic frequencies. And when we talk about Hardy-Weinberg on the next video, we'll talk a little bit more about these allelic frequencies. But typically, for any gene, we have dominant alleles and we have recessive alleles. And anytime we have fluctuations in those allelic frequency, that tells us that there's change happening to the population, which by definition is what evolution is change to a population. So let's look at a few other things that can affect gene frequencies. We already talked about natural selection having the biggest impact on it, but there's other things also that can change what goes on with a population. That's one of my favorite pictures that I have throughout this course is a little monkey with the suitcase and the tie. Maybe that's what I look like to you guys when I'm sitting up there with my ties every day. But gene flow is all about migration. You're moving in or out of a population. So I grew up in Chicago. When I went to school at San Diego State, I took my genes out of Chicago and brought them over to San Diego. And then when I brought them over from San Diego to Vegas, they left San Diego and came over to here. This is immigration and emigration. Immigration is moving into a new area. Emigration is moving out of a new area. And if a group moves in or out of an area, they bring their genes in or out of that group. And that can cause some big time changes in frequencies. That can cause big time differences in what's going on with the population. So we move genes in and out of the population, and that's going to cause changes to the frequencies or disruption to the allelic frequencies, which by definition is what evolution is. That's going to be change for the species. Another one that we look at, the roulette wheel. This is always a good one. Now I hate this name, genetic drift, because genetic drift really doesn't tell us what this is. Genetic drift is about random chance or chance events that are going to change what's going on inside a population. With a big population, this might not be as big of an issue going on. With a smaller population, this can play a really big role. And one example I always give you guys is, hey, let's pretend I took you onto an island and I just leave you there because I'm that nice. Well, if I leave you there, eventually someone will start making babies and that stuff will go on. Now, let's say we have blonde hair and dark hair kids in the class. The blonde hair kids like to live down by the ocean. The dark hair kids like to live up in the mountain. If there's a tsunami that comes and wipes out those blonde hair kids, guess what's going to happen to babies in the future? They're all going to have dark hair because those blonde genes just got wiped out by a chance event. And in a small population, that can have a massive, massive effect. And some examples of chance events are natural disasters, possibly disease, which, hey, we can even look at coronavirus right now. Now, humans have kind of a large population, so probably won't have as huge of an effect, but it could have a bit of a change going on. Anytime you colonize a new area, that's kind of a chance event. That picture on the right of the screen over here is a picture of something that happened in Vegas about 5-6 years ago. We had a big forest fire up on Mount Charleston. Well, that's a chance event that changed the populations up on Mount Charleston greatly. And whoever was able to survive is going to be reproducing and moving their genes forward in the new population. There's something called a founder effect, which I do want you guys to read a little bit about in your book, but the founder effect has to do with who starts a population in a new area. Climate change can cause chance events. So all of these things are chance events, which is what genetic drift is. Please don't think of genetic drift as genes moving in or out. That is gene flow. Genetic drift is all about chance events, which is why I put that roulette wheel. I tried to put pictures up here that would sort of relate to what's going on with each one. One thing that happens with small population is something called a population bottleneck, where we look at a parent population, there's some kind of chance event that occurs and takes out a lot of the population. If you look at the picture on the left over here, we can see that it's a really good mixture. After something takes place and sort of moves everything forward, all of a sudden we have got a smaller population. All of a sudden there's some survivors. Well, if you look at the genetic makeup of our survivors compared to what we had at the beginning, look at the bottle on the right now. A lot more blue on the right than we had on the left. There's a lot less yellow on the right than we had on the left. That's because there was something called a population bottleneck, and this happens as a result of chance events potentially. Think of the tsunami wiping out all our blonde kids on the island. All of a sudden, the dark hairs were left to reproduce. They survive, they reproduce. There might still be some blonde recessive alleles hanging out in there, but we're going to see a lot more of the dark-haired kids going forward. The last thing that can have an effect on population is mutations. And this is something we really don't have any control over because well, I'm sorry, there's one more after this. I forgot about non-random mating. But mutations we don't have any control over. This is something that happens on a cellular level. And when we talk about a mutation can be one of three things. It can be deleterious. Deleterious is bad. If it's a bad mutation, you tend to die. If you die, you don't survive, you don't reproduce, and that mutation goes away. Well, think about cancers. Tend to be mutations sometimes. A neutral mutation doesn't mean it's good, doesn't mean it's bad. So that neutral mutation may very well pass on if the person that has that mutation or the organism that has that is allowed to survive and reproduce. A beneficial mutation is something that potentially makes you more suited for survival. Maybe it's a color change. Maybe it's a little bit longer of an arm or a little bit longer of a leg. It's some kind of random mutation that is successful. Well, mutation rates are a little bit higher. They tend to happen. I mean, it's not something that we can predict. It's something that, well, we can sort of predict it because they happen at specific intervals, but we can't predict what the mutation is going to be because that's going on at the cellular level through mitosis, meiosis, all of that. We'll talk a little bit more about mutations in a future slideshow that I'm going to put out there. But this is absolutely going to have a change on what's going on with the population because mutations affect phenotype potentially. And if the phenotype is successful, you survive, you reproduce, and it gets reinforced within a population. If it's not successful, it doesn't get passed on because the organism has died. Now we're at the last mechanism of evolution. That's something called non-random mating. Well, we typically don't choose mates at random. We choose them for a very specific reason. With a lot of plants, they can do self-fertilization. And with self-fertilization, we talked about that resulting in potentially polyploidy, which can result in a speciation event. We might get more homozygous genotypes in certain plants for certain things. That's something plants do. They weren't chosen at random. That's just sort of how things go. We also have sexual selection, where females or males choose each other based on certain features. The book talks about frogs, and having a deeper ribbit might lead to female thinking that the male frog is more apt for survival and she's more willing to make more frogs with that male frog. Looking at certain coloring. Remember we looked at the dimorphic ducks, how males had to have very specific coloring patterns for them to be desirable by the females. So non-random mating is something where mates choose what mutations and what phenotypes are going to be desirable as generations move forward. And those are our 5 mechanisms of evolution. Remember, natural selection is by far has the biggest impact on evolution. We also have gene flow, which is immigration, emigration, moving in and out of a population. We have genetic drift, which is chance events that can change population frequencies, mutations, and non-random mating. all of those things are going to have an impact on the overall change in the population, which leads to evolution. Hope you enjoyed. Talk to you on the next one.